work in progress. I would welcome comments from you, critique, any suggestions. We do have a few questions at the end we will ask you to think about, primarily about what else can we do with this data set that we have. I welcome questions as we go along, so don't hesitate to jump in. You can just raise your hand if you like. I'm not able to see your chat because I have the full screen going here. So maybe Maha, you can monitor any questions in the chat and just jump in. So with that, the title, as you saw in the brief summary of this work, is Process Mining for Juvenile Justice. But I also want to share with you that this is part of a larger research program that we have, which comprises of many smaller projects, including the one that we are going to talk about. So what I decided to do was, instead of focusing only on process mining in juvenile justice, which we will do in the latter part, I wanted to give you a kind of our journey into how we got here and how it fits into this larger research program, which we call Analytics for Social Justice, and how we got here. This might be helpful, particularly for junior faculty, PhD students who are thinking about, a line of research, a stream of research that they want to be part of. And so I encourage you to think about the bigger picture in addition to the papers that you're working on. My co-authors, again, on this are Arturo, Monica, who's joining us here today, both my colleagues at William and Mary, and then Erin Espinoza from Evident Change. So you'll see the two logos on the right-hand side here, Celonis and Evident Change. These are our partners in this research program. So Evident Change is a not-for-profit organization that's more than 100 years old now. It is devoted its work to juvenile justice, child welfare, and so on. And they work with US states as well as internationally. So they've been helping us with the data that they have access to. And Erin, of course, is a co-author here. Celonis is a German company that does process mining, and they have a very sophisticated system that does process mining. And they've been partnering with us, and they're working with us on other work. So I want to acknowledge the help from Celonis as well as Evident Change. So how did we get here? We got here because we got interested in justice. And how did we get interested in justice? Because we had worked on a paper that eventually was published in MIS Quarterly in 2022 in the special issue of Digital Resilience. And what we were looking there was for the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is our state of Virginia, where we are located here in the US, how it built digital resilience with digital tools, first to the opioid crisis, which is a very serious crisis in the US and worldwide, where a lot of people get dependent on opioid-based drugs. Initially, a lot of them for good reason, because they had some surgery and they had to manage their pain. And then there is dependency issues where they become dependent, and then they kind of go off the prescribed medicine and get into street drugs. And that has led to a lot of overdoses and deaths in the US. So once we started researching that and how Commonwealth of Virginia responded to that with digital tools, with data, with analytics, and then providing that information to different people, and how they learned from that. This was more than 10 years in the making for the opioid crisis. And how did they learn from that and applied it to the COVID crisis, which is more recent, that we are familiar with. So that's what we were researching for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And in doing so, what we found was that there were these institutional boundaries that were creating difficulties for sharing data. And therefore, it was leading to what we would call unjust outcomes, or unfair outcomes, at least for a certain segment of the population. And that's where we started thinking about justice. Did somebody have a question? I heard somebody say something. Okay. Um, and I have a background in law. I'm a law graduate, and so I've always had this streak in me about fairness, and it upsets me like everybody else when we see things that are not fair, particularly those institutions of the government that are supposed to do things in the interest of the public, and with despite their good intention, don't always do the justice. So hence the line, justice is blind. We all know that. But my question then is, should we ignore data? Should we be blind to data? And the answer is obviously no. There is a lot of data out there. We should leverage that, and we should take advantage of that. So, what is social justice? It's a fair distribution of opportunities and privileges in a society. And the society needs to make sure that there is reliable evidence that justice is being delivered to the citizens. Uh, and what we found through these social justice related projects, that data is important. It advances justice, but it's not the only thing. It's necessary but insufficient to address these social challenges that are societal level. At that point, I also wanted to digress a little bit and say that discipline, the IS discipline, started out with, if you look at MIS quarterlies of the 70s and early 80s, you will find papers discussing how do we improve managerial effectiveness. So they were individually focused at that time. And then in the 80s and 90s, we moved to firm level analysis. How can we make firms smarter, better, more efficient, more profitable? And then we started looking at industries, with the e-commerce and so on. We started expanding our footprint to industries. So it's a very logical step for us as a discipline that has reached a level of maturity to start thinking about societal level challenges as opposed to industry and firm and individual like we did in the past. So that is a natural progression because we have now sharpened our tools, we have the expertise, and we have access to a lot of data now. So that's why data are necessary but insufficient to address these grand societal challenges. But we have to still try, and we have to make sure that in addition to data and the analytics and the findings from that, we present it to people who can make a difference. So yes, there are technical issues. There are always technical issues, but we know how to handle them. But what we are concerned about in the path to delivering justice is all the complementary changes and challenges that come along the way that have to be put in place in addition to data to make sure that we move closer to the ideal form of social justice. So in that regard, I wanted to just share with you this graphic here. So we are interested in social outcomes. Here, that's what we want to get at. But what do we have as tools? What we have as tools are data sources. And these are different government agencies, departments, for-profit, not-for-profit organizations that have these data sources. And it's by design that I have not connected them. They look like islands of data. And that's what they are, islands of data where they're not talking to each other. There's a wealth of information in them, but what we have found is that they are primarily interested in optimizing and making their own processes more efficient, because what they're really interested in is making sure that they can justify their budgets, they can justify their responsibility, and they don't have an incentive to go look at other departments and see how we can integrate data unless somebody encourages them to do that. So these are islands of data. And there are technical challenges, as I mentioned a minute ago, because these data standards are different. They define citizens differently. They are in different systems, different proprietary data. And so it's a technical challenge already. But we know how to fix that. We've done that with lots and lots of companies all over the world. So once we overcome those technical challenges, we still don't get to the social outcomes or societal outcomes of social justice. There are other barriers too, or challenges. And they start with institutional challenges. Like I said a minute ago, institutional challenges are challenges about making sure that they have the data for their own purposes to make themselves more efficient. And their metrics are also designed in a way that do not encourage sharing this data. So, for example, courts justify their efficiency by saying how many cases did they dispose of this week. Uh, Law enforcement will justify their work by saying that uh, by tracking metrics that said these are the number of convictions we got as opposed to the number of arrests that they did. But they're not looking at what's happening to the individuals across the justice system, across the law enforcement system, across the penal system, and how is it turning out for the individuals who are going through the system. So those are those institutional challenges of incentives and people responding to with behaviors that align with the incentives more than the big picture. Then there are human behavior challenges. So even when you overcome some of the institutional challenges, what we found in our research was that there is this tendency to hoard data, to keep data to yourself for good reasons. And that is people worry about if I share this data, am I violating some legal or compliance issue? So they hesitate to share because they don't know what the implications are. And more importantly, they worry about if I share this data with you and you use it in a way that was not intended to be, then it could do more damage. And that might actually make them look bad. So they have some genuine concerns about not sharing data, which we label as human behavioral challenges. Only when we overcome the technical challenges, the institutional challenges, and behavioral challenges do we get to social outcomes. So this is the pathway that we see from data on one end to societal outcomes on the other end, and all these things that we have to do in the middle. And this corpus that I'm describing is very well suited for the IS discipline, because a lot of us work on technical areas, others work on institutional theories and so on. And then there is also a behavioral aspect to a lot of IS research. So I think we are very well positioned to handle these things if we are able to connect these dots. So here are some other opportunities for IS scholars coming from the framework that I just described. So for example, we can devote our time to look for disparities and inequities in our society. Data can help us show that. And I also want to step back here and say that in any of these projects, we are not saying what the government should do or what the institutions should do or what's the right thing for society. All we are doing with the tools that we have is analyzing data and presenting the data back to the institutions and people who can make a difference, sort of like holding a mirror to them and saying, this is what your performance looks like, this is what the inequity or disparity looks like. You decide how to address that. So at no place do we want to say we are the policymakers or we decide what is right, what is wrong. That is up to society. So our job here is to identify those inequities, disparities, to assess the effectiveness of policies past and current, or maybe even proposed policies. So we can assess and say, what if we make a change to this policy? What impact is it likely to have on the outcome, whatever that might be? That may be, the opioid use. It may be about other social justice. It could be about human rights. It could be about voting rights. Any of those things we can, with our data tools that we have, do a policy assessment. We can also look at vulnerability and disaster preparedness. So if COVID taught us lessons, one of which was that there were certain people or certain groups of people in our society that were more vulnerable than others for various reasons. And while we wanted to be fair and be equal in our response and helping people, there is a difference between equality and equity. And by equity, we mean that making sure that people who need help get help, or people who need more help get more help. So for example, during COVID, I didn't need any more food. I have a lot of resources in my home. I have freezers full of frozen food. I have canned food. I can live for a week, 10 days, 2 weeks without somebody having to drop off food twice a day. But there are certain members of our society that need food delivered twice a day. So I would rather have those vulnerable populations be served first before they come to me. And that's the difference between equality and equity. And so data can show us that. And some of the work that we have done, I'll share with you in furthering that. And then also look at the resilience of certain communities and not just to COVID-like disasters, but even natural disasters. How vulnerable are certain populations and what we can do to help them. So these are just some examples for IS scholars to think about how they can contribute to this social justice idea. So here is the overall program that I was talking about. So I'll give you a very quick overview of these projects, and then next few slides I'll describe some of these projects in more detail. The first one we won't spend too much time on, other than to tell you what it was about. I've already referenced that. It's published in MS Quarterly. This was the digital resilience where we got started. So here we were looking at society's health needs, safety needs, justice. We also looked at the vaccination program and see how we were able to make sure the vaccine get to the right place at the right time, and then how second dose gets delivered and location, how are people informed, all of those things. So I won't talk more about this one. The next one is vulnerable communities, as I just mentioned. Here we were trying to identify what are the needs of which vulnerable communities and how do we improve their well-being, whether it's health, food, medicines, and so on. The third item that's listed here as a project is something called Transition Age Youth. This is a program in California that we became part of, and this is what led us to where we are with process mining. So here we were looking at information systems as a mechanism to gather and analyze and disseminate data about this program called the Transition Age Youth Program, and I'll define that in the next slide as to what that is. And then the final one, the juvenile justice, which you can see that there is a relationship between transition age youth. These are young people who are, adolescents and going into adulthood. So juveniles are also these young people where we were trying to see how data integration from mental health and juvenile justice combined can help us understand how the justice system deals with them. So let me just go directly to the vulnerable communities part. So here we have developed a vulnerability index for certain communities by zip code across the US. And what we've done is to identify with the use of this index which communities are more vulnerable to what kind of disaster. So food, shelter, and other relief. This paper, just yesterday, we got a revise and resubmit from ISR on this. So this is moving along. Hopefully it'll get published. So we are very excited about this work. So with this work, we are going to test the effectiveness of the various vulnerabilities and how good is the forecasting to certain kind of disasters. One of the things we learned during COVID was that what happens if you have more than one disaster at one time? So COVID was going on and there were hurricanes or earthquakes or fires going on. So how do we combine these, and how do we prioritize our resources and investment and resources to these different kinds or the combination of disasters? So our objective here in the last one is to help agencies figure out how can they make the use of resources in a way that it helps more than one disaster. Maha.
Sorry, I'm not sure if this is a real question or not, but I'm wondering as an IS person, especially when I come across lots of different papers that come into ISR, MISQ, other journals, often they'll ask the question, well, how are you theorizing technology or IT or anything that's digital? Do you ever get asked that question when you're looking at issues that are more related to social justice?
All the time. In fact, our son who's not an IS person, was asking me, "What are you working on?" And I started telling him about this. Like 3 minutes into the conversation, he says, "Dad, why are you working on this? This is where is the IT in this?" So, Ma, you're right. We get that question asked a lot. Um, and the answer to that question is that the contribution is not so much about technology, it's more about the data and analytics part. And so that's what we are planning to theorize. And I'll share a little bit of a theory building with you that we are extracting out of this. But that is a very good question. And that also means that perhaps, depending on the nature of the paper and the contribution you're trying to make, perhaps IS is not the best outlet for this work. So I encourage our community members to think about even management journals, the Academy of Management, other organization science that are not purely IS journals, because the contribution of your work is beyond uh, IS or any one discipline. So the vulnerability index that we have, uh, we are targeting towards IS, but it could also be, for public health and safety. So depending on what contribution you're trying to make in your paper, you may choose an outlet. But that's a great question. We get asked all the time, not just in this context, but others too. So the Transition Age Youth, or TAY program, is in California. It was a pilot program that California decided to implement in 5 or 6 counties. And we were able to interview people across the board, except the children. They won't allow us to talk to them for privacy reasons. But we talked to people from lawmakers to probation officers to justice-related people. And what we learned there was that these children between 17 and 24, some may not call them children because they are nearly adults at that point. But nevertheless, the research in psychoneurological disciplines and other behavioral and developmental disciplines has shown that despite legally being classified as adults, their brains are still not fully mature. They're still kind of growing. And as a result, for those of who remember their own teenage years or have children who are teenage, know that we engage in risky behaviors. We feel we are invincible. We do things that as adults we look back and say, why, what was I thinking? So they do engage in risky behaviors, and many times they get into trouble for that, for risky behaviors. Um, but we also found through research is that this criminal activity that they might engage in wanes off as they grow, which kind of supports the second bullet point that their brains are still growing. And so, what lawmakers and social activists found was that perhaps the system is not treating them with recognizing this fact that they are still growing. And that has led us to a theory development, Maha, to your point, uh, about developing theory, what we call as theory of accountable justice. There's a lot more here, but I'm just giving you a bird's eye view of what it is. The two key constructs that we have in theory building for theory of accountable justice are transparency. And transparency means that we need to make data understandable and accessible to the public. There's lots and lots of data that governments put out as reports, but they are not in a form that the public can understand and realize the impact of that. Only experts can understand what really is the meaning behind it. So transparency is making data accessible to the public in a very comprehensible, understandable way. The second construct that we have for accountable justice is reflection. And reflection means that policymakers, community leaders, the system as a whole should be given data about their performance and how upstream and downstream their performance impacts the lives of pay in this case. or whatever the social justice objective is, to have them reflect upon the data, the performance, not just their own, but also how it affects others, where they can sit back and think about, is that the performance they would like to see? And our hope is that, and our experience in talking to many, many people and in interviewing them, is that because they are good people trying to do good things, um, that this reflection will help them understand what they need to do to achieve the goal that they have set out to achieve. Many of them have chosen these careers despite not being the highest paid jobs that they have, because they believe in the cause. So reflection is a second construct where we want to make sure that the justice system produces uh, information on their performance that is integrated across the system for them to reflect upon. We also recognize that there is dual accountability here. And dual accountability means that we just can't ignore the fact that when a Tay commits an offense or crime, which is more serious, that there is somebody affected by that. There is a victim there who's also a member of the society. So we want to make sure that they are held accountable for their behavior, but with the recognition that they engage in risky behaviors. And how can we prevent them from getting that far? Instead of our sole goal being to penalize them. So, and then also we want to make sure on the flip side is, how do we hold courts, policymakers, lawmakers, social justice institutions accountable for making sure that, in this case, they succeed and prosper and live a more contributing um, life in the society. So these are our basic constructs that we are thinking about. There is more around it that I won't go in, but we are thinking about theory development coming out of this. And again, to your point, Maha, about where is information system in this, what we will argue is, when we draw pictures showing these constructs, is what is the engine that drives this transparency and reflection, because it requires a lot of data, a lot of analytics, a lot of human side. The picture that I showed you, the institutional barriers, the human behavior barriers, all of those things have to come together for us to produce these two things. So then from there, since we were working with juveniles in the TAY program, we started thinking about healthcare data. How does healthcare data, in this case mental health data, interact with the juvenile justice data, which means when they were arrested, they were sent to court, the court decided what to do with them. Should they be sent home? Should they be put in a jail? All of those things we started thinking about. And we took this approach through machine learning first. And in the machine learning part of it, we were looking for explaining the pathway of this juvenile's journey that they go through in the justice system, while we understand that there is a mental health diagnosis, because many of these young people come from troubled backgrounds and they have mental health issues, and whether the juvenile justice system is recognizing that and doing something about it. And we talked to judges also, and they said, look, if we know at the time of making a decision on how does this person gets accountable for their action, if we know at that time their mental health issues, that might help us explain why they did what they did, and it will impact the sentencing. It will impact the disposition of how we do that. There was a case here in our state of Virginia where a young person who was involved in a car accident was stopped by the police, of course, when they came out, and he wasn't looking straight at the police when they were talking to him. He was looking around and not following their orders, and so that offense of an accident became more serious because he was not complying to the orders of the police. So they arrested him. Turns out the young person had mental health issues, ADHD, bipolar, all of those things. So obviously the police did not know at the time. Otherwise, they would have treated differently. Now, I'm not saying that this information should be available to everyone, but certainly accounting for the mental health data will help us move closer to justice. And here, what we have done is taken data from the state of Texas in US, um, and combine that with mental health data also from the state of Texas, with the help of Erin, who's our co-author, and Evident Change. So we have a question here. Gio?
Yeah, if I understood correctly, so in the first couple of slides where you explained about the challenges, and like data integrating, collecting data, different data sources together, like my impression was that there is assumption that if we can, if there's more data, then the I don't know, like the performance of data analytics for certain outcomes will increase as well, like it will improve. But I was thinking like in the research on AI fairness, we also talk a lot about like the biases existing in the data. So which means that if even if you have like a lot of data, then if like the data has within it some biases represented, then that actually leads to certain outcomes that are not fair to certain groups of people. And I just wanted to, I just wondered what's your take on the issue of the quality or the biases represented in the data. So because like now that you are talking about the juvenile justice data, which is about their, I don't know, these young people might be might commit crimes, might be in jail, which I can imagine that for certain groups of young people are like overrepresented or underrepresented. So I just wondered like what's your take on this issue here?
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. What you asked is actually a set of complex questions. So I appreciate your picking up on first the significance levels. When you have large data sets, statistically, everything will come out significant when you have a million records. And then the second part of your question, which is the biases built into the data. Yes, we recognize that every data has bias in it, which is why we bring in domain experts. The last bullet point here is integrate domain expertise to refine these predictive models to recognize where those biases are. Um, and so you're right about machine learning can easily be tricked because it's using past data. That's the nature of science is we assume that the future will look like the past, and sometimes, many times, the past was not pretty. So we don't want to replicate the past into the future. So the to address those bias issue, first we have to recognize what that bias is or might be. Um, Maybe we think it's a bias, but it's not a bias. So let the data tell us if we see that bias. In fact, some of the things that we've been working on, not in any of the projects I've described today. Monica, you can jump in about our work with our friends in Minnesota about police. Um, they thought there was a bias, racial bias in police, but that's not what the data showed. The data showed that when people of certain race were being stopped more often by police, it was not because of the race. What they found was it was more about how new the police officers were, which means if they were in their first year, second year of their job, they were the ones stopping more people. So the bias was not on the racial side, the bias was on the longevity of their experience. So to answer your question, yes, there is bias. We must recognize what the bias is. It starts with saying what the biases might be and then testing it through data. Oh, I should also say now, in social science, uh, uh, bias depends on who you're talking to. Everybody has biases. One of my former bosses used to say that I would take a biased person over an ignorant person any day. So at least a biased person knows something to form that bias, as opposed to somebody who doesn't know what this data means. But that's just a joke, but there is some truth in that. But the point is well taken that we must recognize bias. I hope I answered the question.
Yep, thank you.
So in this combination of mental health data with juvenile justice data, we took two approaches. The one is the machine learning that I just mentioned, and the other is the process mining, which we will discuss in greater detail today. And here we were investigating placements, like what happens to a child after they go through this process, or juvenile after they go to this process, whether they get placed outside their home in a supervised facility or a jail, or they get to go home under the supervision of their parents or their family members, or even foster care, for example. So juvenile justice in the US is quite complicated. And here is where I would ask you to think about, if you are not from the US, to think about what kind of issues, social justice issues, you are experiencing in the location that you are in. But just by way of a background on juvenile justice in the US, it involves three stages. Whenever a juvenile goes through this process, so the first is detention, where when they commit an offense, they're detained by the police. Then they go and see a, a judge or some officer of the law, who then hears the case and then decides to dispose of the case, whether guilty, not guilty. And if guilty, then the decision has to be made about placement. So there are three stages. Placement is, where do they go from here? Do they go home? Do they go on bail? Do they have to come back? So what our focus is on placement. So our focus in the last part of it, what we are arguing is that without a complete mental health profile and history of the juvenile, juveniles cannot be placed in the facilities that do not cater to their needs, their medical and therapeutic needs. And we have seen that go wrong, that they were placed in a facility based primarily on their action, with little or no regard for their mental health status, and that worked out really badly. So detention is a very contentious issue in the US because it has such bad effects on the mental and physical health. And it's also more punitive in the sense that the desire is to punish the person. Remember, I talked about dual accountability. So the society says, no, we should, or at least part of the society thinks we should penalize this person, so it should be punitive. And also public safety, because the rest of the society wants to feel safe. But if you ignore the mental health aspect of it, then it's not helping anyone. They may temporarily be put into a detention where they don't belong, but when they come out of detention, it may look worse for the society or public safety. So here are our data sources. I won't go into detail about the number of cases. Our data is from 2007 to December 2014. I believe, Monica, help me out here. We do have additional data coming to us, which we will refresh.
Yeah, we have data not just from Texas, but also from other states that have seen this work presented and now want the same sort of analysis.
Yeah, so this work is, thank you, Monica. It's picking up steam in the sense that when we present these findings in a public forum or share with people, so we are looking at more work along these lines in the future. So we collaborated with juvenile care institutions. This is the technical aspect to identify the data crosswalk, which is a fancy word of matching the data, because these two different departments have different way they format their data, different way they account for data, and obviously technically we have to have a common field or a key that links the two data sets. So we work with experts in the area who helped us figure out that data crosswalk where we can then combine the two data sets, which is a very important first step. Without that, either your analysis will be wrong or you just won't be able to do the analysis. So with the first approach that we took was machine learning, and there we were trying to forecast out-of-home placements. Why? Because out-of-home placements are not so good for the juveniles. And so we want to make sure that those who are being placed out of home have the background that has been considered by law enforcement and the justice system that deserves that outcome. And we want to be clear that our primary goal is not to predict who will commit offense. And some studies in the past, a decade or so ago, did that, and it ended very badly. So we don't trust that prediction aspect because we're dealing with humans. Instead, what our goal is to explain the road that they take, the path that they take, that leads to this outcome. So in other words, it's what the system is going to do to the juvenile, not the juvenile, what the juvenile is going to do to society. And in that work, which is under review right now, second round, we developed what we call as marginal contribution weightings method. So here is the contribution to analytics. So depending on how we position the paper, it goes, and it is in Informed Journal of Computing. So it's well suited to that kind of outlet. The MCW, as is stated here, is a method to compare the features of two or more models. So in this case, we had two models. One was the base model where we had only juvenile justice system data. And then the second model is when you enhance that data along with mental health. So what we want to see is what's the incremental value of bringing in mental health data. And our hope, expectation is that it will explain more than just the juvenile justice system. And so this MCW method allows us that comparison, the delta between the first model, base model, and the extended model. And what are some of the feature sets? That's a fancy word for saying what are some of the drivers of that outcome. And on the next slide, we'll just talk about the top two here. So these are Shapley values. What you're looking at, these bars, is the delta, not the Shapley values themselves. So Shapley is a game theoretic model that lets the features compete with each other mathematically and then realize which one is more dominant. And so what we did was to have the two models and then look for differences between the two models. So the two things that came out on top from this machine learning technique that we used is the recommended versus actual level of care, means medical care that was given. So one of the things we found was that when a juvenile is assessed for mental health and a diagnosis is made and a treatment plan is put in place, you would expect that whatever the physician, the medical professional decided as a recommendation for therapy or medication is what we will get. Not true. What we found was that the recommended level of care was different from the actual level of care that the child was given, the juvenile was given. And so that turned out to be the biggest driver of out-of-home placement. And the second was the offense that they committed. So ICD-9 is actually a medical code for conduct disorder, adolescent onset. That's the technical title of that ICD-9. So those that had mental health related issues that affected their behavior was the second highest determinant of the disposition of out-of-home placement. So that gives us a clue as to where to look. What are some of the things that will make the biggest difference? And now we step into the second approach. Yeah, Maha, go ahead.
Sorry, I was really curious about the third one. Race was very, very close by and it wasn't so different. And I was wondering what you meant by that, like, because you've got these nice little explanation bubbles for the first two, and race
Yeah.
and the one just above it aren't that different. So race clearly does seem to play a key role here as well.
Yes, it does. But statistically, it might not have, because the ones that we have boxes around are the ones statistically more significant. Monica,
Yeah, what we're trying to highlight, race is actually part of the juvenile justice data set. And we're trying to highlight that when you add mental health features, the mental health features float to the top. So race is still a very important feature, but the ones that we have in squares are new features that we introduced that describe the mental health condition of the child. And what's really telling is that they became some of the most important features, even more important than what crime they committed in predicting out-of-home placement.
thank you, Monica. So put another way, Maha, the reason why you're not seeing race significant is because this chart is about the delta, the difference, meaning that race would have been dominant even without mental health data. Right. Gio?
Yeah, I just wondered if this graph shows the delta. I wondered because like some of the variables were not available in the base model, the M1, right?
Yeah.
That's before this mental health data were integrated in your model. And I was wondering what then the delta for these variables mean.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that question came up, Monica, during one of our reviews, right? Like one of the rounds of reviews.
So that is, without going into great detail, I could send you sort of the technical write-up. That's what our method did, our weighting method did. So that is a delta in the weight. So those metrics showed the biggest delta that's in comparison to 0, right? So all of a sudden their Shapley value was so much more significant. All of these are significant from a Shapley perspective because you're looking at the Shap value across the X. But these suddenly carried a much larger weight. And what our method did is it allowed us to compare apples to apples by creating a methodology to capture the partial weight difference, even though the feature set wasn't the same size. I don't know.
Yeah. I think like
And I
I
can
got
follow
that.
up
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. No, that's a great question that we've got to ask that as well. And yes, there are certain features that are not in one data set that was in the other data set. And so one could argue that that is the value the addition brings, even though there's no delta there. So the second approach of process mining is, and we are still working on it, so the results are very preliminary here. The idea was to capture over time, the temporal and sequential nature of events that happen to this juvenile as they pass through the system, and what are some of the critical bottlenecks? What are some of the places where they get stuck? What are some of the touch points? Where do they interact with the system, and where do the system is not efficient in treating them? And so our preliminary results indicate that there is huge potential for cost savings, even though our data that I'll share with you as some preliminary data, we are still analyzing that. We could reduce the costs by limiting these placements that are not necessary and recidivism, which is repeat offenses, and improve the outcome if the interventions were done in a timely fashion. And then, of course, we have some numbers there to show you. And what we are trying to avoid, or at least highlight, and hope that the policymakers avoid, is what is called as detention spiral, where they are in the spiral that they keep rotating, and even when they get out of it, they come back to that spiral and continue on it. And that does not help anyone. I mean, that's not only expensive for the state and the system to handle that, but it's not good for the individual either, and their outcomes as well. So what we are also thinking that this approach of process mining that we are taking is more generalizable beyond juvenile justice, or beyond this type of juvenile justice that we are looking at. And we could look at applying this in other domains, child welfare, overall healthcare, wherever there are silos of data that is time sensitive, where, for example, in general healthcare, you have diseases that are progressing every day. And so there is always this debate of prevention versus treatment. So what if we spend uh, more money and devote more effort upfront, even though it costs more, but in the long run, it will be good for the patient as well as cost less for the system. So anywhere you have these domains of siloed data that is time sensitive because things are changing over time, process mining can show you where are the bottlenecks, where are people getting stuck, where is the delay, where is the highest cost, who's touching the system, and in other words, who should be accountable for taking care of that. So now I'm going to share with you a few screen prints. I don't want you to try to read this because it's very, very dense. This is only to show you that when we try to do process mining manually, this is actually version 2. The first version was actually on pen and paper, like hand drawn. So this is, we still put some boxes around, but it is very messy. And now imagine you have 250,000 cases of that. There is no way you can manually process this, so which means you need a tool. But it was a beginning of our understanding, going back to the question that came earlier, how do we decide the biases? We had somebody working with us who has been a probation officer, who has done research in this area and has firsthand experience. Even when this person was growing up, they experienced the system, and they were able to help us understand the pathway and the process and how it follows. But to overcome this, we went to Celonis, and Celonis was very interested in this work, and they gave us an in-kind grant of their time and tools to help us analyze that. And so a little bit about process mining. So process mining is not new. The tools are newer, much more sophisticated. We've been doing process mining for a long time, where we were tracking processes, and mostly done in customer service, for example, returns of items, or at what point does the customer bail out in an online setting when they're trying to purchase something. So we are trying to understand the behavior of the customers, where the process is not helping, where the process can be automated, where can it be more efficient. So we are applying the ideas of process mining from a business perspective to creating an impact in the juvenile justice area. So here, therefore, one case, one customer interaction in general process setting in sales or marketing or inventory management is the equivalent of one child here. So one case is equal one child. One end-to-end flow of a process is actually one life, like one individual's lifespan. So just to draw parallels across that. So when we apply process mining, only process mining to social justice context, we are looking at a case management, how this individual's case works. But to create an impact, we have to think about how the justice system and the healthcare systems interact, and not interact when they're in silos, and how the individual is impacted when these two data sets come together. So, and on the right-hand side, to creating impact, what we are looking at, showing the actual paths of those individuals as they traverse through the system, so that we can understand where the weaknesses and the deficiencies of the system are. And in doing so, we are constructing the life cycle of that juvenile in this case, to see how they're going through the system and what happens. What we don't have, and we would really like to have, is what happened to them once they exited the system. And again, because of privacy reasons and other social reasons, we are not able to access that data or even identify those individuals. Because in many cases, excuse me, like in the TAY program, if the juvenile goes through the TAY program, by law, their record is wiped clean. And because of that, we don't know who they are, because there is no record anymore, for good reason. So I just want to share with you the the part of the process that we are privy to and others that we are not. So if a child, in this case juvenile, is in a process loop, that means they're reoffending, they're coming back to the system. And so I'm going to share with you what a normal path looks like, and then how it gets complicated very quickly. So this is what a normal path of a juvenile looks like. If everything goes well, they are referred, they're prosecuted, they're given probation, there is supervision during that probation. Supervision ends, successful, they leave the system. All right, so this is the normal path. The exception path, where something out of the ordinary happens, is where they are referred here, but they are put in supervisory caution probation. They leave, but they come back. And then they kind of, this is called recidivism, where they keep offending, keep coming back. So a little more complex, but it's about to get more complex soon. Here's another exception path. Now you see the different variations. So what this is helping us is to understand that 1.48 thousand referrals here suggest that there are fewer people out of the hundreds of thousands that we had, but they're committing more serious offenses. So obviously, with process mining, we are saying, who are these individuals? And then which of these, when the supervision starts, go to the court, and which ones are dismissed? So we want to understand the difference in these juveniles, and how many of them end supervision successfully and how many of them don't. So this is giving us a little bit more depth into it. But here's what we want to share with you is our finding, is that juvenile that have mental health issues.
Can I add something real quick on the last figures? So,
Yeah.
so these are just one of a potential thousands of exceptions, right? Because these are all in the aggregate. So one kid could have a completely different path. And you'll notice that there's days to how long it takes, 5 days, 12 days. This is again in the aggregate, but we can start drilling down. So one thing we're learning, it's very human in the loop, unlike machine learning. Like we can start investigating different cases to see what happens to these kids. Thanks.
Thank you, Monica. No, thank you. And in fact, that is what leads us to individual cases that you'll see on the next slides. So in this case, what we are finding is that the mental health issues make it 3.5 times more likely that this juvenile will enter a detention spiral. So there's good news, bad news here. There's good news is that in all of juveniles, this is the top circle, there's only around 4% that are in detention spiral, which means 96% are not. So that's good. But those that have mental health issues, that number goes up to 14.37%. Still a small sliver, but the number is now larger because they have mental health issues. So one of the things that process mining is telling us is to drill down into these individuals and see what is going on here, because this is still a very large number. 14% of 250,000 is still pretty large. So despite 73% treatment accuracy, here's another insight, is that 73% of the juveniles got the treatment that they were recommended. All right, so that's good. Despite that, there were reoffenses more frequently, and they stayed in the system longer. So we are still working on what are the other 27% and what proportion of the 27% is recidivism and what percent of 73% is. So that's where the delta will help us as we move forward. And we found that delayed mental health referrals, 223 days on average, may actually worsen the outcomes. And that means that those juveniles will spend more time involving with the system instead of preventing it. So the system is not helping them if the mental health referrals are delayed. So this is the time sensitive part that we were talking about earlier, is that every day that you wait, the condition may get worse. And if they're out of the system, then with that condition, they may be committing more offenses. So here is the case study that Monica was referring to, that, looking at one individual now. Don't try to read the picture on the right. It is very complex because this is one juvenile with early mental health needs, how that juvenile got trapped into a cycle of reoffense and detention. 22 reoffenses, 16 detentions, one mental health treatment. The first referral at 13 was for mental health, but received only one treatment. Multiple supervisory caution 13 times, but no real intervention, which means there were times they were evaluated, but nothing was done to them. Probation failed. Violence, the violations continued to escalate, which means that each time it escalated, the sentence become harsher and harsher, which means it becomes more punitive. And despite one mental health treatment, the system was not investing resources in treatment, but on detention, which is what we were talking about earlier, is that if we spent the resources, the amount of money and time early on, we wouldn't have to spend so much on detention for a longer period of time. Now I'm going to show you screen prints. Monica, jump in if I miss anything, from the Celonis process mining system. So this is about the same juvenile that we just showed you the graph for and statistics on. Here is one treatment that they were given. 22 offenses, 87 activities that they were involved in. And here they are, the different offenses: burglary, expelled from alternative education program, theft, a violation of juvenile court order, which was a probation, again burglary, assault, violation of juvenile code. So each of these violations itself becomes an offense, and then it starts to escalate. And you can see the dates here. It's happening fairly regularly, but over the many years. Oops, sorry. Monica, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, so you'll also see that now we can see that we're trying to debias, right? So we actually don't pay a lot of attention to sex and race because the data set composition is actually prominently a certain sex, mostly males, and it is mostly Hispanic and Black. So we really don't want to draw conclusions about that. But you can see it is a Black male, and he's 13 when he first enters the system. So he's a baby. I mean, it's really sad. And then when you see this chart across the bottom, this is as time passes. He was just given one prescription to treatment, and you can see accumulating just the number of referrals and treatments, and he's just the gap between what he was prescribed and what he got just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So this kid did not get the mental health treatment that they needed, and that's why you see the treatment accuracy of 0%. In our data set, we have treatment accuracy from 0 to 100%. Right, so we are highlighting the absolute worst case scenario. This guy's the worst in our data set, just to make a point of us digging into one particular case.
Thank you, Monica. So where did it go wrong? Well, as we just summarized, early mental health needs were ignored. There was one treatment. They should have had at least 20. Or they may not have had need for 20 if they were given early treatment enough times. So justice system relied on supervision and detention instead of the medical help that they needed. Probation turned out to be ineffective. There were so many violations, as you saw, and the cycle continued. The cycle of detainment, release, referral, with no pathway to exit. It just kind of continued. So this is now the cost part. We're very early. We've been working on it just a week or 10 days ago. We are still refining this. So here is, you're looking at, this is not at the aggregate level. If you look at these headings: no mental health interaction, confirmed mental health interaction, but inaccurate, which means they were not given what they were prescribed. And this is the accurate one. So if you think about these as three columns, the individuals who were given the treatment that they were recommended, and this is where I want you to pay attention on the average number of contacts with the system. So those that had no mental health interaction interacted with the system 9 times. Those that had a mental health interaction and got the treatment interacted only 2 times. But those that have mental health interaction and not given treatment 27 times. I mean, these numbers tell a story. Right here is that
And it's on average, right? On average.
on average, yes, on average. This is at the global level. So, and you can see the treatment costs on average, $5,202. And here you're looking at the rate of detention spiral, these green dots. So the rate of detention spiral is low 20% of those who are placed in the hospital, and so on. And the cost, we are still trying to refine the labeling here, so you can see the cost also increases as they move forward.
Rajiv, I think important to point out, like if you look at the confirmed health interaction, when they got accurate treatment, the encounter is more expensive, right? 7,500. But that doesn't mean anything because if they only have 2 treatments versus having 5,700 as a cost and having 27 treatments, there is a real cost. Rajiv, actually going back to one of your other papers, right? There's a real cost of not intervening on time. So it might cost you more upfront, but in the long term, it won't cost you. And that is going to be part of our economic analysis.
Yes, and that's a very important point. Thank you, Monica, for making this number that you're seeing, which is higher than any of these numbers here, does not account for the cost of detention, all the other things, and perhaps most importantly for social justice, what it is doing to the juvenile and their ability to become part of a member of the society going forward. That data is missing. If I could have my wish, I would like to have data available for 30 years from the time this juvenile entered the system, oftentimes when they were teenagers, to going through the system and what they are doing now after they exited the system, to be able to backtrack and see what were the interventions that helped them or what were the interventions that did not help them. And the cost in...
As we speak, our co-author just sent us sort of the summary costs for prosecution.
Yes.
So the justice things. So, okay.
Jump in if there is anything interesting to add to this slide after you read the email. Yeah, I see that on my iPhone. So yeah, we're working on this project as we speak. So this is very preliminary, but the more time you spend just looking at these portals and these dashboards, the more questions come to your mind and you wonder about certain things. And I hope that
the rate of reoffense too important to point out. 37% of kids reoffend, where around 68 those and 64%. So very high reoffense rates for kids that have mental health issues, which really clearly indicates that they need a different path than the kids that are just in the system without mental health issues.
Great. So I'm going to just conclude this soon so we have a few minutes for Q&A. We have a YouTube link for the video. If you want to watch that, go to 10:40, 10 minutes, 40 seconds, just to show you a graphic representation of that child going through the system. I have it lined up. Let me see if I can play that and if it works. Okay, let's see. So there's the play button.
He had a probation deferred, then he had he's just hanging out. And then boom, detained, comes all the way through. released from detention and he hangs out over there for a bit.
23 down.
And then he goes to this court deferred. Oh, this is his path. Okay, I get it now. Oh,
Mm.
they'll finally adjudicated. So now he's found guilty of something.
Yeah, somewhere he would be placed in the secure correctional and
Yep.
discharged. Yeah.
Why is it? I mean, that's literally visual. It's really cool because literally, you guys, it looks like a big ping pong game, right? Like he's just hanging out and this not even in court yet, just kind of circling, and then all of a sudden he
Oh,
goes to secure.
Let me
No in between.
stop that.
Don't stop. It's like he missed the whole process in the middle, Monica, which is go on probation, get services.
How can I stop this?
Frustrated when they finally got him with the felony, they were just like,
Okay, all right, I can stop
he's a
this now.
runner.
Yeah. Let me get back to the slides here. Were you able to see that? Okay. You can see it was a author conversation where we were trying to interpret in real time what was happening. Ma?
It's not so much a question as just sort of a comment that I've, so we all watch the news, and I come actually mostly from the UK myself rather than Spain, and we know some of these things, and I know that being in the UK, it's a welfare state. The fact is, there is no money to resolve these issues. So the scary thing is that what you're showing is that if the money isn't spent up front to fix some of the big issues, we would end up saving a lot of money down the line, but there's absolutely no money actually for governments at the moment because we've gone through recessions. They've been cutting back on all kinds of different programs that they had started, I don't know, 2 decades ago, at least in the UK. So, I mean, what's the way forward? I mean, you're absolutely right. You show the problem and then policy people are supposed to take over, but it's kind of scary when you see it the way you've just shown us, and then we can't do anything about it.
You're absolutely right. And Ma, that problem exists everywhere. In healthcare, identifying at-risk patients and intervening before things get serious. We see that even in our individual lives, right? We'll do temporary fixes instead of changing the system, and we'll keep coming back to it and keep coming back to it again and again. We don't invest the time in. So all these self-help books that talk about personal efficiency say invest the time in changing the system of your procrastination or whatever, and not fixing one thing at a time because you'll keep coming back to it. So, and that is the challenge. I mean, if I were a policymaker, and all of our nations have so much borrowing that they do, deficit spending, I would borrow a chunk of money, go into deficit spending, and use that money only for prevention, spending the upfront part, and then pay that off with the long-term savings. But we all work in think about planning in quarters, or if you're a politician, when is your next election? Are you going to win that election, lose that? So we are always very short-sighted with our goals and objectives that we don't think of the overall outcomes. So I agree with you. So here are some of the key initial findings from process mining, and I think this is probably one of the last slides. High detention spiral risk. So juveniles with mental health issues have 3.5 times the risk of being stuck in that spiral. That delayed mental health interventions, over 200 days gap between referral and treatment, makes things worse. Probation alone is ineffective. So because there are multiple violations, that supervision is not always the answer. And that the longer a juvenile is in that system of this spiral, the offenses get more serious. So you have to deal with more serious things later. So it's getting worse over time. Not only is it costing you more while they're in the system, but it's getting more severe too. And then we found that system prioritizes detention over care. Could be for political reasons, because on the campaign trail, it helps to say, look what I'm doing for law enforcement. I put more people in jail. I put more police on the road, which is all necessary. but that gets more traction than saying we are investing in mental health of juveniles. So sometimes that may be the issue. So here is our request for feedback from you.
Rajiv, before you go to this slide, can I quickly add? We presented this in Germany at Celisphere, and I have to say that I was very positive that we've got a lot of attention, and it was apolitical in the sense that I think humans are generally interested in understanding a process through data. And I feel strongly that we can depoliticize some of these issues if we can show data. And that's part of the reason we're going after sort of the economic analysis, though my initial interest is the outcome of the kit. But if we can attach a dollar euro amount to this, then it's probably more likely that we can start to affect policy.
That's a great point, Monica. We did not start with financial impact. As Monica said, we were more interested in the pathway for juveniles and what it does to their well-being. But we also recognize that to get the attention of policymakers, you need the financial impact. It has more traction. And also for policymakers to get the citizens on board with that, the financial impact gets people's attention. So that's why we are going in that direction. As coarse as it might be, we think that it's going to help us communicate that message more effectively. So, any feedback on what are some of the other ways we can explore this data for other types of justice or for other goals that we would love to hear from you? And the other question is about how do we get policymakers to how do we get their attention? How do we influence them? What are good venues to publicize what our findings are other than journals? But the problem is our journals are only read by scholars and not necessarily policymakers. And then some applications of process mining to other themes, perhaps themes that are more relevant to the countries where you are. You may have other serious problems where process mining can help you understand the pathway of the different activities that lead to these social outcomes. So this is your turn.
Can I comment and ask a few questions, Mahan?
Sure, Asim, go ahead.
Yeah. In very interesting work, Professor Kohli and Professor Monica. So I have a comment in that when I was listening to your presentation, it reminded me of the work of Robert Sapolsky, who really said that there's no free will, and then all the crime that is happening has some neurological biases to it and stuff like that. So, which sort of supports your assertion that the recidivism can be a factor of not getting treatment for mental health? I don't know if you'll agree or not.
Just my thought on that. We wouldn't want to get into free will discussion. That's a longer philosophical discussion. But I will agree that more recent neuroscience research indicates that many of the decisions we make, we are still scratching the surface, by the way, on neuroscience, very early stages. It indicates that a lot of the decisions we make are influenced by the chemical makeup of our brains, especially when they're growing. So there is an influence. How much of a determinant it is or what percentage it contributes vis-a-vis free will, that's a question for philosophers, I think.
Yeah, and just to add on to more support that you said 17 to 24 can still be classified as kids. Yeah, again, if you look into biology, you will see that prefrontal cortex has not matured until you are 25, 28, or 30. So that also supports your argument. So great research. Congratulations to you on that. One comment I have is, how would this change if the juvie detention centers are for profit, like in the case of Colorado or Alabama? Because
excellent point. In fact, I was thinking of the same example in the cases of jails, privatizing jails, in one of the slides where we talk about assessing policy interventions, we can look at the intervention of the point where a state privatized juvenile detention facilities or jails and what the impact has. So that's a natural experiment we can do.
And last question I had was harkening back to what Maha said, that how do you theorize about IT? Because I was thinking there are mass deportations going on right now, and even if we have a human story on that, whether deportations affect immigration numbers or not, how can we theorize about IT for junior scholars if they were broaching this topic, Professor Kohli? What IT angle should we be looking at?
I think that the more path of least resistance might be to make a contribution to methodology in terms of machine learning or methodology with process mining that we talked about, or as in the paper that we have under review for vulnerability index, there the contributions towards methodology. Or if you have some way to make a contribution to the analytical approaches, so then the analytics and data become more central. But you're right about the theme of social justice could be the context, but as purely the central contribution of the paper will probably not be a best fit with IS journals. Although IS recently had, MISQ recently had a special issue.
Special issue on social justice, yeah.
Social justice. I should also mention that our theory paper made it to the second round and then did not make it afterwards. So we were part of that as well. So yeah, we are seeing more and more examples of social justice related themes. So if you have a special issue on that, it would be a good target. But generally speaking, I see the impact on methodology. Monica, I'd like to hear from you. Monica is also on the editorial board of ISR.
Yeah, I think as a young researcher, this might be a topic that I would tiptoe around for now until you are more confident in your research stream, because it's difficult. Rajiv and I are sort of in the sunset part of our career, so we're taking on bigger topics and we're not that scared about whether it hits the journal or not. This is a difficult topic to be navigating in, but I do think the methodology, and I must preface that by saying I'm a design scientist, so I might have a bias, but method contributions might be an area where you can make a great change, particularly in the area of explainable AI. Some of the things that Asim mentioned, biases. Yiho, you also mentioned, biases in the data sets that you use. So as a young researcher, I think I agree with Rajiv that I would look at more methods rather than the big picture policy papers for now.
Those of
Thank
you
you.
are cricket lovers from England, don't do this in your first inning. Do this in the second inning.
Thank you for that feedback. Thank you so much for the comments. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Rajiv and
Yeah,
Monica,
sure,
thanks so much for presenting this. It's super interesting, and I congratulate you on attending to a topic which is so relevant and important in terms of informing policy and not so many other things. When you started this research, did you approach it with any sort of a priori intent of fishing out issues related to mental health or treatment or anything? I noticed that the traditional things like household income or presence of two parents weren't in your data. Or did you just let the data speak?
It was the latter, yeah. We did not start with a priori. As I've mentioned, the journey led us to this area. And some of that was, we were able to access mental health data. And as it turns out, from our co-author who's an expert in this area, mental health is one of the biggest influencers. So it was kind of coincidental that we had access to that data. We didn't even start out with social justice, Jonathan, as a theme. We were looking
Okay.
at digital resilience, which is where we saw the opioid crisis and the COVID crisis, and that's where we kind of got exposed to these inequities.
But Jonathan, you bring up a good point. Our work with Virginia, we realized that the reason Virginia was able to be resilient was the ability to get different government agencies to share data to get a fuller picture of what was happening in the state during these crises. And similarly, we think that there's a lot of intersection in this space in juvenile justice, and we are just touching the tip of the iceberg by looking at mental health. Some of the things you mentioned, Jonathan, are also really important, particularly their interaction with foster care. So if they're removed from the home, but we just don't have access to that data now, but that's really the goal, because this is a demonstration in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
Say, this is the power of being able to do this.
Yeah,
Okay, so let me so you know this space far better than I do, but I imagine not everyone agrees with the premise of what you're presenting, that, medications for mental health are always the appropriate response to it, right? There are probably a lot of people out there in policy and medical and public health who would say, psychopharma has gone way too far. We're over medicating people. We think you just solve every social problem with a pill or something like that, right? And so they may come back to you and
So the overwhelming treatment is core cognitive behavioral.
Oh, okay,
CBT.
okay. So, but I mean, you brought up this issue of transferability to other areas, right? So, what would you say to your critics that are saying, okay, this research is paid for by the farm industry, or this research is paid for by the cognitive therapy lobby industry, or something like that, or we could say the same things about climate research paid for by Exxon, or health research paid for by the tobacco industry. What would your defense be in that case to say, we had no, we weren't looking for this result, right? Because that's what you're telling me, right?
Yeah, I would say,
Is that
first of all, in our disclosures, there will be no disclosures of any payment from any industry.
Yeah.
But second thing is, like I said in the very beginning, we are not here to make policy. We are here to hold a mirror to society and policymakers.
Yeah.
And so we lay out our cards. This is public data. We lay out our cards and say, here is your data. Here is what we found. Here is our methodology. Here's what we are seeing. To your point, very well made point about other factors such as parental income, all of those other aspects. My response would be that wonderful. If you can bring that in, that will probably explain more of the variation. So if anything, we are understating the impact of some of these things.
Yeah. No, I'm not doubting your results at all. I'm just trying to think about when you I guess the first criticism would come up would be, you found this result because you were looking for it or something like that. And I'm just wondering, you were looking for this result ex ante or something like that. And I wonder, at least on a technical level, what your response to that would be, right? Because it applies to any policy area fundamentally.
Sure. Yeah. So what we were looking for, not the result, what we were looking for is, does integration with mental health data explain more of the variation of this outcome that everybody wants to address?
Yeah.
And once we get into it, the quick answer was yes. And Gio, your point, the more data you add, the more significance it will be. But we're not relying on regression data and statistical significance. We are looking at much more sophisticated techniques to say, what if the answer is yes, that mental health explains more. Now tell us what more, or which one of these features explains more. And then, as you saw in one of the slides with the boxes around, those are the features that come up to the top. And then we share that with the policymakers or the institutional leaders and say, this is what we are seeing. We can run this analysis again with additional data if you have, but this is the mirror. So in that point, we are not putting a dog in the fight here. We are saying simply, this is your data and this is what we are finding.
So we had some surprising results. Our co-author, who's a probation officer, and she herself has gone through the system. She was a foster child that interacted with and now is a PhD. But she thought that a lot more kids were not getting accurate treatment. So 73%, that accuracy rate really surprised her. And she also thought that girls were way worse off than boys, and the data doesn't show that. So we have had some really surprising findings, and we've only begun to sort of dig in, because what has been surprising to me, at least, is that coming from a very quant background, ML, right? I'm going to look at weights and figure stuff out. This is much more human in the loop. We're going to have to sort of look at cases and decide when to dig in and when to use something as an example and what's appropriate, because we have all these deviations. So I think part of what we might publish will be like, how do you make sense of process mining data, right? Particularly in this kind of context that's not normal or usual for process mining.
Well, it's super interesting. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. No, you raise good points. Something we should think about to preempt any of that suspicion that people might have when they read this. Any other questions or comments?
Wasn't sure.
We are at time, Ma.
Yeah, we are. I wasn't sure if Jiho had. I mean, he did have his hand up, but I'll let, yeah, if he wants to, he's very able to ask. I suppose I just wanted to end on, a really nice qualitative study. I know you don't do qualitative work, Professor, but
we do actually, we do.
But it would be really cool to follow a couple of these cases through to see, because I mean, you can definitely change for young juveniles who are really young, like 13-year-olds and coming into the system early on. But the ones that are 25 have sort of already become, I don't know if the right phrase would be hardened criminals. I don't think that's very fair. But people who've gone through the process so many times and they meet so many other criminals that they learn the techniques better, of course, through all of these detentions. How do you fix those problems are very different. So I would love to see, the process through not as process mining, but as a process study. But that's very different. That's just.
Yeah, no, we tried that, Maha. As I mentioned, they won't let us because of privacy reasons. But we did hear from the institution side that helped this one individual, Monica, you remember we interviewed him, who helped a juvenile because the juvenile was very interested in repairing cars and he knew how he was a mechanic. So they kind of bonded. So we heard from his side that this person eventually led to a more meaningful life afterwards.
Yeah, the California tape study that I put the Hicks link is actually qualitative. So there's big parts of this that have to be qualitative because we have to understand what people are thinking.
Thank you. No, that's really cool. I'll read it. I clicked on the link, so I've saved the paper. I am going to take a look at it. But I mean, what you just said, even this is one few seconds that you mentioned, the fact that he found somebody who he could look up to and he could work with. I mean, it's just about getting them the right role models in some cases. So we kind of know what to do. We should just be doing it. I don't know how to make that happen, but yeah.
Yeah, and we cannot leave it to chance. Like in this case, it was a serendipity or chance. One other factor that this person mentioned is because from where he was detained to the county courthouse in California, which is a big state, was a 2-hour drive. So when he would take him to the court for a hearing, they would have 4 hours together in the car and they would talk. He would ask him questions or he would tell him what he would like to do. So this was a bonding moment, right? For them to be together for 4 hours in one day. But that's a chance. Our hope is that with these kind of stories and these kind of outcomes that we have, we can have the policymakers think of something more organized, where it impacts larger set of juveniles than this one individual case.
No, that was great. Thank you. Sorry, Jiho, I did step in and you kind of unmuted and then I stepped in.
No, it's totally fine. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Did you have a question, Jiho?
No, actually, like on the first point on your last slide about like how to utilize your data. I'm pretty sure your team already considered this, but just in case you haven't, I keep thinking about the bias issue in the data, and one thing that I encountered is that actually like to mitigate the effects to mitigate the after learning that in the process model predicting recidivism, actually the race and gender are also like prominent factors. And if we want to like in this feature importance plot that the race and gender do not appear at the top, then one thing you might consider is like this resampling, oversampling of like some like unprivileged group who are like more successful in certain outcomes, and undersampling the privileged group cases who are like less more successful, right? So like in this case you can make some balance between the regarding the representation of different groups and their like outcomes, so that those group membership factors like race and gender does not appear as important factors. So I think like there are a lot of like methods you can use. Like one thing I know is SMOTE, SMOTE, so which is kind of like replicating some of the data, some of the observations in the data, so that you can balance out the effect of those like sensitive information, such as gender and race. So just in case you haven't considered this, but I'm pretty sure you'll let it have.
Thank you. That's very good. And you're right about the imbalance. Just in our data, you can see more juveniles do not have mental health issues, fewer
Exactly.
do. So there is a
Exactly.
mismatch right there. So how you control for it is, I think, is the important part that you're raising.
Mhm.